Hi there folks, Mr. G here with another educational video. Today we're going to be talking about what makes a living thing, along with some examples of bacteria and viruses that go along with this. Now before we dive into our notes, don't forget to put your name, the block, as well as the date, and this is going to be page 2 of our notes. Before we dive in today, I'd encourage you to pause the video right now and think about what sort of characteristics or what things would you say make something alive? So what sort of things does it have to have or do? What sort of properties does it have? I'd really encourage you to think about that. What makes something alive in your mind? Now, Western science, which is the science we've been learning about in our classes, defines 7 characteristics that an organism must have to be considered living. The first thing is it has to be made of cells. Now we've got 3 examples here, an amoeba, a fire, as well as firewood, and we're going to be looking at each of these to see if they meet these criteria. So amoebas are single-celled organisms. There's no cells in fire, but firewood actually has a lot of cells in the wood itself. The second thing is it needs to take in nutrients. Producers, like plants, make food from sunlight, while consumers, like animals, eat other plants or animals. An amoeba is a consumer. Some are producers, but most of them consume little bits of food or other matter wherever they find themselves. Fire consumes oxygen, wood, and or other materials. Firewood used to be a producer when it was part of a tree, but can't anymore because it is no longer part of the tree. It's been chopped out of the tree. The third thing is it needs to produce waste. We produced waste. Urine, feces, carbon dioxide, cells remove waste through a process called diffusion. So anything that is living needs to produce some waste. For amoebas, they produce waste like carbon dioxide, similar to us. For fires, ash is left behind when they burn. Firewood doesn't produce any waste. Fourth one, need to respond to stimuli. Stimuli just means things that are happening. So when something does something to it, or when they receive a signal from somewhere else, they respond. They don't just ignore the signal. External stimuli are things happening outside the body. Internal are things happening inside the body. So amoebas, for example, respond to external stimuli. They move away from bright lights or will go after food or move in the direction of food potentially. Fires respond to external stimuli. If it's raining, the fire will get smaller. If there's a gust of wind, it can move in certain directions, different weather conditions. Firewood in general doesn't really respond to the stimuli. Fifth one here, we need to grow. So cells getting bigger or organisms making more cells. So our amoebas get bigger and even split after a long enough period of time. Same with our fires. Our firewood does not. And plants often actually grow in the direction of the sun, and so this growth can actually be part of their response to stimuli. So if a plant notices the sun is always coming from one direction, it'll grow towards it. Or animals oftentimes will move or get away from danger. That's another example of external stimuli. Our organisms, to be living, need to reproduce. They need to make more of their own species, pass on their genetic information. For amoebas, their parent cells can split, like we said. They can get bigger and eventually split, like we saw in our last lesson. Fire kind of reproduces in that, a fire can spread and start more fires, or sparks can create new fires. Firewood, not so much. And finally, it needs to use energy. So it needs to make or obtain energy and use that to perform other cell processes, like responding to stimuli, growing, reproducing, getting rid of waste, things like that. So our amoebas eat other organisms. They use energy to grow, split, move. Our fires take in chemical energy, so in the form of firewood or anything else that it's burning, and it turns it into heat and light energy. Firewood, not so much. It can absorb heat energy from the sun, but doesn't really use it for anything. So if you shine a light on it or you left it out in the sun, it could get warmer, but it doesn't use that to complete any of these other processes because it doesn't do them. So for our amoeba, it's considered living because it checks off all these 7 boxes. Our fire is not living because it misses on a couple of key things, one of the main ones being that it's not made of cells. And our firewood is non-living. It used to be part of a living organism, used to be part of a tree, but now that it's been cut away, it doesn't check off most of these boxes here. So from a Western science perspective, it is not living. Now let's take a look at two different, but for a lot of us, we kind of consider them similar things. Bacteria and viruses. We talked about bacteria last time. They are single-celled organisms. Oftentimes they live clumped together in colonies. They can have different shapes depending on what kind of bacteria they are. And they all have cell parts that perform different functions. So this is a pretty simple diagram of a typical looking bacteria. This coiled stuff in the middle here, that's their DNA. If you remember from last time, they don't have a nucleus to hold it all in, so it's kind of just hanging out, just all over the place. They've got ribosomes here, which are things that make proteins. So they take in energy and can make proteins to help the bacteria function. It has a protective cell wall around the outside, a cell membrane that can allow things to pass in and out, so it allows waste to go out and food to come in. It has these hair-like structures which allow it to sense and see kind of the things around it. And these tail-like structure called flagellum, and they use that to move around to get close to food or away from danger. Now I'll post a video later about bacteria and viruses, but these all grow, reproduce, they take in nutrients, they get rid of waste, they respond to their environment, they can move around and go closer to food or away from danger. And if we go through our list of all of these different parts, it's a cell, the entire thing is a cell, it can take in nutrients, produce waste, responds to the stimuli around it, it can grow and then eventually reproduce, and it uses energy to complete these processes. So bacteria are clearly a living thing. A virus, on the other hand, and a lot of people think of bacteria and viruses as pretty much the same thing, both of them make us sick, but viruses actually behave very differently. So unlike our bacteria, we don't really have a lot of parts for our virus. Our virus basically just exists as some DNA, which makes the virus what it is, as well as protein, a capsid shell, that basically just keeps the DNA safe and helps it move around. We've got a whole bunch of different examples of viruses here. So this picture looks like a bacteriophage, but there are lots of other different types of viruses that pretty much have the same structure. A shell encasing its DNA. They don't have all of the cell parts that other cells do to take in nutrients, use energy, produce waste, and they can't actually reproduce on their own. They need the help of a host cell. So what it does is it injects its DNA into the host cell, and what that DNA does, it sort of hijacks the host DNA. So typically this DNA would tell the cell how to reproduce, grow, create proteins, and do all of that. But now with this new DNA there, it sort of hijacks it, and instead of giving instructions on how to keep the cell alive, it gives instructions on how to make more copies of the virus. And eventually, after it makes a bunch of extra copies of this virus, the cell eventually dies because it's not doing the things it needs to stay alive. These viruses now escape, new copies of it, and they continue to spread. So it attaches, inserts its DNA, it makes copies of the DNA and the virus proteins to house the DNA. The viruses are assembled and they break out and kill the cell. Viruses can evolve like other things. Their DNA can be changed through mutations over time. And scientists aren't clear about whether viruses used to be living things or always existed like this and then eventually evolved into what they are today. But ultimately, because they are not able to do many of the things we consider important for living things, to take in nutrients, use energy, and produce waste, they are categorized as non-living things, though this is still a little bit controversial. Some scientists believe that viruses should be considered living and that we need to have a different definition or a more flexible definition of what makes a living thing a living thing. Now, we were talking a lot about our Western schooling, science, categorizing the environment, into different subjects of study like chemistry, biology, history, physics. But First Nations don't tend to categorize the environment in the same way. Their traditional ecological knowledge tells them that everything is interconnected. And this is because they've spent countless generations, or many, many generations, developing with their environment and developing a connection with it that is passed down from generation to generation. And this traditional ecological knowledge can be about specific plants and and how they fit into the cycle of life in a certain region, spiritual connections, its relationship with seasons, other organisms, history, stories. And this understanding encompasses many of these, what Western schooling considers, different subjects or different study areas: biology, spirituality, geography, meteorology, psychology, medicine, history, art. And this is not to say that one is better than the other. There's no right or wrong, there's no better or worse. There's benefits of thinking in both ways. For example, separating these subjects of study can help us see similarities amongst things that we would study in chemistry, biology, history. We can look at the similarities, apply similar procedures to help us study and learn more about them. However, traditional ecological knowledge tends to lend itself towards understanding something in a larger context, because instead of thinking about different pieces, we're thinking about all the connections between all of the pieces. And in particular, this different understanding about how plants and life and different areas of knowledge interact with one another comes to a head when we look at the ethics of living versus non-living things. For First Nations, everything in an ecosystem has a spirit, and everything is alive. For Western science, as we saw, some parts are living and some parts are non-living. And oftentimes, when we classify something as living, we tend to give it more respect, or more rights, or more protection. And non-living, we tend not to give those sort of respect, rights, and protection, because we don't consider it to be a living thing. However, some of the downsides to classifying things as living or non-living come in ethical questions. If we don't consider something as living, do we have to protect it, right? This can guide how a person behaves. Do we treat things differently if we think of them as living and non-living? And generally we do. And this is something that's explored not only in the world we live in, but in literature and fiction. Things like viruses in science fiction, or androids, machines that look and act like living humans. What sort of rights should they have if they're considered non-living? Do we need to expand what we define as non-living? Would they be treated as slaves? How do we deal with things that don't fit neatly into these two categories? And should we be treating things differently if they fall into different categories? And as we advance our ethical knowledge, and as Western society in particular begins to grapple with this, we start to recognize the importance of giving rights to things we consider non-living. For instance, rivers that have been mistreated and polluted all over the world, from Australia, New Zealand to India. And these rivers in recent history have been given legal rights, protections, and classified as a living person in some places under some legal codes. And this distinction of living and non-living, right, with protections, poses some interesting ethical concerns. What should we be considered living? What should we be protecting and respecting? These are big questions to answer, and I don't expect you to have all the answers right now, but I think it's an important thing to think about. That's the end of our video here. Make sure you watch all the other videos, as well as do any other questions or homework that I've posted, and I will see you all in the next video.